The sound of silverware clinking against fine china barely masked the tension in the air. I sat rigidly at the long mahogany dining table, the golden chandelier above casting a harsh glow over the pristine dishes, the polished crystal glasses, the forced smiles. Thanksgiving dinner at the Lawson estate had always been a performance, but that year the script had changed. I reached for my water glass, my hand trembling slightly as my father, Dr. Richard Lawson, set his wine glass down with a decisive thud that silenced the room. "You're an embarrassment," he said, his voice cutting through the air sharper than any scalpel he ever wielded in his operating room. "You dishonored everything this family stands for. Don't come home again." For a moment the world tilted. I glanced around the table, desperate for someone, anyone, to intervene. My mother lowered her gaze to her plate, her hands clenching the linen napkin in her lap. My brother, Daniel, didn't look away. He met my eyes with a smirk that barely concealed his satisfaction. "Maybe Amelia just couldn't handle the pressure," he said lightly, raising his glass in a mock toast. To those of us who actually uphold the Lawson name, a few awkward chuckles from distant cousins echoed around the table, more out of obligation than genuine amusement. I felt the blood drain from my face as my heart pounded against my ribs, each beat screaming at me to run. Slowly, I placed my fork down beside my untouched turkey and cranberry sauce. I pushed my chair back, the screech of wood on marble, like a siren in the now quiet dining room. No one stopped me. No one said a word as I picked up my coat from the back of my chair and turned away. As I walked through the grand hallway lined with portraits of generations of Lawsons in their surgical garb and honorary degrees, I realized something that would stay with me forever. I wasn't part of this family anymore. Maybe I never had been. Outside, the crisp Savannah night wrapped around me like a second skin, the scent of fallen leaves mixing with the salt air from the nearby river. I didn't cry. I refused. Instead, I walked down the gravel driveway toward the city lights in the distance, each step heavier than the last. 5 years. That's how long it would be before I heard from any of them again. 5 years of birthdays without calls, of Christmases spent alone in cramped apartments, of forging a life peace by agonizing peace without the safety net they had yanked away without hesitation. I rented a room above a laundromat in downtown Savannah, the scent of detergent and steam permanently etched into the faded wallpaper. I worked nights waiting tables at a run-down diner, scraping together enough to pay for law school one semester at a time. There were nights when I sat huddled over textbooks with ramen noodles as my only meal, my fingers numb from the cold seeping through the cracked window, my resolve the only thing keeping me warm. There were mornings when I barely made it to class, my uniform smelling faintly of bacon grease and stale coffee. And yet each exam I passed, each paper I submitted, each grueling semester I survived built something inside me that the Lawson family had tried so hard to crush, a foundation not of privilege, but of sheer unbreakable will. Every day I reminded myself of my father's words. Every day I turned their rejection into fuel. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their money, their connections, their empty legacy. I would build my own, alone if I had to, and stronger because of it. Little did they know the disgrace they had cast out into the cold would one day return, but not to beg for acceptance. No, I would come back wearing the very title they never believed I could earn. And when I did, they would have no choice but to recognize the daughter they had tried so hard to erase. The room I rented was barely bigger than a prison cell. A narrow bed with a sagging mattress occupied one wall. A battered desk sat under a tiny window, and a rickety heater groaned in protest whenever I tried to coax warmth from it. Outside, the streets of downtown Savannah pulsed with life, neon signs flickering above dive bars, the occasional siren splitting the humid night air. But inside, my world shrank to the size of a textbook, a notebook, and the clock ticking relentlessly toward another dawn. Most nights, I stumbled in after a double shift at the diner, my feet blistered from hours of standing, my apron still stained with coffee and grease. I'd kick off my shoes, collapse into the chair, and crack open my law books, willing my brain to absorb statutes and case law through sheer exhaustion. Sometimes the words blurred together until I couldn't tell the difference between tort and contract, between rights and remedies. But I pressed on. I couldn't afford the luxury of falling apart. No parents to call when rent was due, no family loans to cushion the inevitable setbacks. When the heater finally died one bitter January night, I huddled under every blanket I owned, wearing 2 pairs of socks and a winter coat to bed, my breath visible in the icy room. I studied for my constitutional law final by the dim light of a borrowed desk lamp, my frozen fingers barely able to turn the pages. But I refused to quit. The faces of my family haunted me during those sleepless nights. My father's stern disapproval, my mother's guilty silence, Daniel's smug contempt. Their voices echoed in my mind. You're nothing without us. You're not strong enough. You'll come crawling back. Each word fueled a slow, smoldering anger deep within me, hotter than any Georgia summer, colder than any winter night. I would prove them wrong, not for their approval, not even for revenge, but because I owed it to the girl who had walked away from that table with nothing but her pride. The first time I saw my name printed on a passing grade, a solid A in criminal law, I sat in the back of the university library and cried silently into my sleeve. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in years, I felt the faint glimmer of something dangerously close to hope. I worked harder after that. I took extra shifts at the diner, studied during every spare minute, skipped parties and weekends out. My world was small, but it was mine and it was enough. During my 3rd year of law school, a professor pulled me aside after class. "Miss Lawson," she said, adjusting her glasses, "have you considered clerking after graduation? You have a mind built for the bench." I blinked at her, stunned into silence. No one had ever suggested that I was destined for anything other than mediocrity. Clerk for a judge? Me, Amelia Lawson, the family disgrace? I nodded slowly, afraid that if I spoke, I would shatter the fragile dream taking shape in my mind. After that conversation, a new idea took root inside me, fierce and bright and impossible to ignore. Maybe I didn't just have to survive. Maybe I could lead. Maybe the girl they had thrown away could one day, with a black robe they reserved only for those they deemed worthy. Graduation day came not with the fanfare of a proud family crowding the seats, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd dragged myself across the finish line by my own bloody hands. I stood alone outside the convention center, clutching my diploma, the Savannah heat already wilting my gown. A few classmates laughed with their families nearby, tossing mortarboards into the air. I let the sounds wash over me without resentment. Their journeys weren't mine, and mine was far from over. That night, sitting on the cracked steps of my apartment building with a cheap bottle of champagne I had no one to share with, I made myself a promise under the blinking street lamp. I would never again let anyone else define my worth. The Lawsons had disowned me, but I had claimed something far more powerful myself. And somewhere deep inside I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The courthouse smelled like old paper and ambition. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as I made my way down the long hallway, my heart hammering harder than it ever had during a final exam. I clutched the file folder to my chest like armor, acutely aware that the other clerks around me, polished, connected, effortlessly confident, all carried family names that opened doors before they even knocked. I was just Amelia Lawson, the girl who waited tables and studied until her fingers bled. But I was here. My first assignment as a judicial clerk for Judge Harriet Wells was a simple property dispute, hardly the stuff of headlines. Still, I pored over every page, every precedent, every whispered piece of advice the older clerks dropped like breadcrumbs. I stayed late, came in early, skipped the Friday happy hours they all flocked to. Judge Wells noticed. "You're thorough," she said one morning without looking up from her notes, the closest thing to praise I would hear for months, but it was enough. Over time, She trusted me with more complicated memos, asked my opinion during pre-hearing reviews, even allowed me to sit in on settlement conferences. I watched her in court, her presence commanding yet calm, her voice steady even when chaos threatened to erupt around her. I studied her the way a starving woman studies a banquet, not with envy, but with hunger. After my clerkship ended, I joined Taylor & Mason, a mid-sized firm with a reputation for taking on cases no one else wanted. On my first day, a senior partner glanced up from his desk and said, "You must be the new paralegal." I extended my hand calmly. "No, sir. Amelia Lawson, your new associate." His ears flushed red as he shook my hand, but I saw the doubt lingering behind his smile. It didn't matter. I was used to being underestimated. I had lived most of my life in that shadow. What mattered was that when I walked into a courtroom, I came prepared to fight for every inch of respect they refused to give. I dressed with precision, sharp suits, modest heels, spoke with deliberate authority, and learned never to flinch under scrutiny. If opposing counsel sneered, I out-argued them. If a judge questioned me harshly, I answered without blinking. The breakthrough came 2 years later with the Riverside Community Preservation case. A real estate developer, well-funded and ruthless, tried to evict a community center that served low-income families. They expected an easy victory until they met me. I dug into permit violations, exposed backroom deals, wove a case so airtight that when I delivered my final argument, even the judge struggled to hide her admiration. When the ruling came down in our favor, I didn't celebrate. I simply went back to the office, drafted the next brief, and kept moving. But inside, I allowed myself a single breath of pride, not for the victory itself, but for proving, if only to myself, that I belonged. Word spread faster than I anticipated. By the end of that year, my name started appearing on shortlists for more prestigious roles. I received a call from Judge Wells herself. "There's a judicial seat opening up," she said briskly. "You should apply." I laughed, thinking she was joking. 32 years old? No political family, no silver spoon pedigree? She didn't laugh back. "You have the right temperament, and frankly, the bench needs more women who understand what it's like to fight for everything." The vetting process was brutal. They combed through every case I'd ever handled, every article I'd ever written. I braced myself for a call from my family, some last-ditch effort to undermine me, but none came. Later, I learned that Judge Wells had intervened, telling the committee plainly, "Judge Lawson built herself. Her family name means nothing here." When I was sworn in, I stood alone at the courthouse steps. No parents beaming from the audience, no brother clapping proudly in the front row. Just me and the quiet weight of a robe heavier than anything I'd ever worn before. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, adjusted the gavel in my hand, and promised myself one thing. I would wield this power the way it was meant to be wielded. Not to crush, but to balance. Not to humiliate, but to serve justice. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered, "They will see. One day they will see." The envelope sat on the corner of my desk like a venomous snake, daring me to touch it. Thick, cream-colored, with the Lawson family crest embossed in gold on the back flap. It practically reeked of tradition and hypocrisy. I stared at it for a long time, the morning light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the polished wood. Diane, my clerk, had placed it with the rest of the day's mail, probably assuming it was just another invitation to some gala or fundraiser. She didn't know the weight it carried or the memories it threatened to unleash. I should have thrown it out. I should have fed it to the shredder without a second thought. Instead, my fingers betrayed me, slipping under the seal and unfolding the heavy cardstock inside. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Daniel Robert Lawson and Sophie Marie Turner," it read in elegant script, followed by the date, time, and location, the Rosemont estate. Of course it would be there. The same estate where we'd spent childhood summers pretending we were royalty, where my father had once declared that only true Lawsons would be married under those ancient oak trees. Tucked inside the invitation was a smaller, handwritten note. The familiar, looping handwriting made my breath catch. "Amelia, please come. I miss you. They don't know I've sent this. Mom." For a long moment, I simply sat there, the note trembling between my fingers. My throat burned with emotions I didn't dare name. 5 years of silence, 5 years of being erased from family photos, omitted from family gatherings, treated as a shameful secret. And now this, an olive branch or a trap. That evening, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, the city lights of Savannah blinking lazily in the distance. I turned the invitation over and over in my hands, weighing the possibilities. I could ignore it, stay in my world of courtrooms and quiet victories, never looking back. Or I could go, walk into that nest of judgment and disdain, not as the black sheep they tried to hide, but as Judge Amelia Lawson, the woman they had declared would never amount to anything. I picked up my phone and texted Lily, the one friend who had never abandoned me. "Got an invitation today," I typed. "Guess who's getting married?" Her response came instantly. "Daniel, are you serious? Are you going?" I hesitated, then typed back, thinking about it. The phone rang almost immediately. "You have to go," Lily said breathlessly. "Not for them. For you. Walk in there like the badass you are. Make them see." I smiled, the first real smile in hours. Easier said than done, but maybe she was right. Later that night, unable to sleep, I dug through an old box in my closet and found the photo album I'd buried years ago. Pages of childhood smiles stared back at me. Daniel and I fishing at the estate pond, racing through the woods, building forts out of fallen branches. We had been close once, before ambition, before expectations, before betrayal had driven a wedge between us that no apology could bridge. I paused at one photo in particular. Daniel, 13, grinning proudly as he pinned a Junior Medical Association badge to his chest, while I stood beside him, clapping wildly. I remembered that day. I had been genuinely proud of him, back when his success didn't come at the price of my existence. I closed the album slowly, my chest tight. The Daniel I had loved was long gone, replaced by someone molded in our father's image, someone who had learned that loyalty only mattered when it served ambition. And yet a small, stubborn part of me wondered, if I showed up at that wedding, if I stood before them not as a supplicant, but as an equal, would it make any difference? Could it crack the fortress of disdain they'd built around themselves? Or at least remind them of what they had thrown away? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to hide anymore. The restaurant was a relic of old Savannah. Dim lighting, heavy velvet drapes, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. I arrived early, choosing a corner table where I could see the door, my nerves tightly coiled beneath my calm exterior. I adjusted the cuffs of my navy blouse, mentally rehearsing a dozen variations of this meeting, all of them ending in disaster. At precisely 7 p.m., the hostess led my mother to the table. Margaret Lawson looked almost the same, impeccably dressed in a cream sweater and pearls, her hair styled in soft waves. But there was something different too, a certain stiffness to her movements, a brittleness around her smile that hadn't been there before. "Amelia," she said, reaching for my hands across the table. I allowed the brief contact, her fingers cool against mine, before gently pulling back. "Mom," I acknowledged, my voice even. We ordered quickly, 2 glasses of wine, a light dinner neither of us would touch, then sat in the heavy silence of things too long unsaid. "I've been following your career," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Brennan case, your reforms for the juvenile courts." I read everything I could find. I stared at her, caught between disbelief and an ache I didn't want to feel. For years I had imagined this, my mother expressing pride, acknowledgement, but always dismissed it as fantasy. And now here she was, offering it in the quietest of voices, as if afraid it might be snatched away. "Your father doesn't know," she continued hurriedly. He still tells people you had a breakdown, that you couldn't handle medical school. She winced, and for the first time I saw not just guilt, but shame. And you? I asked, my tone sharper than intended. Did you correct him? Her eyes dropped to her napkin. Not for a long time, she admitted. I was afraid. Of him, of losing the family's approval of everything. I picked up my glass, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. You were afraid. I was alone. The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. She nodded slowly, tears glinting in the corners of her eyes she refused to let fall. You're right. I failed you, Amelia. I failed you when you needed me the most. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation formed a distant backdrop to the rawness at our table. I didn't come here for apologies, I said, finally, my voice softening. I came because you asked me to. I know, she whispered, and I'm grateful. The waiter brought our entrees, and we pushed the food around our plates, neither of us eating. Eventually, my mother reached into her purse and slid a small box across the table. This was your grandfather's, she said. James took it after the funeral, but it was always meant for you. I opened the box slowly. Inside lay a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth with age, the initials WJL, William James Lawson, engraved elegantly on the back. Inside the cover, a small photograph of my grandfather beaming at me at my law school graduation. I closed my fingers around the watch, its weight grounding me in a way no words could. Thank you, I said, my voice thick. My mother smiled sadly. Whatever happens at the wedding, just know, not everyone in this family feels the same way about you. I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket, feeling its reassuring weight against my heart. I didn't know if her words could undo the years of absence, the decades of disappointment, but they cracked something hard and frozen inside me. As we rose to leave, she hesitated, then reached out to brush a stray hair from my face the way she had when I was a little girl. For a moment, I let her. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I watched her walk away down the cobblestone street, smaller somehow than I remembered. And I realized that forgiveness, like power, wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about choosing to stop letting it define you. And tomorrow, I would take the first step back into the world they had tried so hard to lock me out of. On my terms, the drive to Rosemont Estate felt like threading my way through a dream I barely remembered. Tall oaks lined the winding road, their heavy branches forming a canopy overhead, filtering the golden afternoon sunlight into scattered patterns on the pavement. As I pulled up to the grand iron gates, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The last time I had been here, I was a girl, pretending to belong. Today, I belonged to no one but myself. I parked my modest sedan between a gleaming BMW and a sleek black Mercedes, ignoring the curious glances from distant relatives milling about the circular drive. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted the pocket watch in my jacket, my grandfather's legacy, and stepped out onto the gravel path. I wore a simple forest green dress, elegant but understated, paired with gold earrings and a quiet defiance that no designer label could match. The estate gardens were in full bloom, a riot of color and fragrance meticulously arranged for the event. White tents billowed softly in the breeze, and strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the east lawn where the rehearsal was already underway. Laughter and chatter floated toward me, but as I approached, conversation stuttered and fell away like dominoes tipping over one by one. I spotted Daniel first, standing by the flower arch, issuing orders to a harried wedding planner with the same clipped authority he had once used to boss me around as children. He hadn't changed. Polished, perfect, arrogant. I took a slow breath and kept walking. It wasn't Daniel who noticed me first. It was Sophie. She stood near the seating rows, clipboard in hand, her simple white sundress fluttering around her knees. When her gaze lifted and met mine, her entire face transformed. She broke into a bright, surprised smile and hurried toward me. her voice carrying clear across the stunned silence. "Your Honor," she called, dipping into a slight curtsy, the same small, respectful gesture I'd seen countless young attorneys use in my courtroom. "I didn't know you would be here." I froze for half a heartbeat, feeling the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests, the ripple of confusion, the sharp prick of 100 curious stares, and then I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that tasted like victory. "Good to see you again, Miss Turner," I said calmly. From the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel whip around, his head snapping toward us like he'd been struck. His expression morphed from confusion to horror to something dangerously close to panic. Sophie beamed, oblivious to the tension crackling through the humid Georgia air. "Everyone, this is Judge Lawson. She's been such an inspiration to me. I interned under one of her rulings during law school." She turned toward Daniel, laughing lightly. "Can you believe it, Daniel? Judge Lawson is here." Daniel's face drained of color, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced out a brittle, "Sophie, Amelia is my sister." The world seemed to tilt slightly as the words dropped into the silence. Sophie blinked. "Sister?" she repeated slowly. Her gaze swung back to me, then to Daniel, the pieces clicking together behind her wide blue eyes. You told me your sister dropped out of medical school, that she couldn't handle it, that she was a disappointment." I tilted my head slightly, watching Daniel squirm under the weight of his own lies. "I didn't drop out," I said, my voice low but steady. "I walked away from a path that wasn't mine, and I built a life worth living." The tension snapped like a rubber band. Murmurs erupted from the guests, shocked whispers darting from group to group. Someone, I think it was my cousin Abigail, actually gasped aloud. Sophie turned to Daniel, her face crumpling into something far more dangerous than anger. Disappointment. "You lied to me," she whispered. "I didn't think it mattered." Daniel protested, his voice rising. "It wasn't relevant." Sophie took a step back, her hands trembling. "You built our future on lies," she said. "What else haven't you told me?" Without another word, she pulled the engagement ring from her finger and pressed it into his palm. Gasps echoed again, louder this time. Daniel stood there, stunned, the glittering diamond heavy and useless in his hand. I watched him without pity. I hadn't lifted a single finger to destroy him. His own choices had done that for me. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need revenge. I didn't even need an apology. I had already won. And my father, my brother, the entire legacy that had cast me out, finally saw me, not as a failure, not as a burden, but as a force they could no longer ignore. Dinner that night was a study in strained civility. The grand dining room at Rosemont Estate, once the site of countless glittering celebrations, now crackled with tension so thick it nearly suffocated the air. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the long table, illuminating faces frozen in awkward half-smiles, wine glasses clinking too loudly, laughter coming half a second too late. I took my assigned seat between my mother and Aunt Susan, my posture impeccable, my face a carefully arranged mask of polite disinterest. Across the table, Daniel sat stiffly, poking at his untouched salad, his shoulders hunched like a man bracing for impact. Sophie was nowhere to be seen, and her absence weighed heavier than the silverware resting neatly beside our plates. The first course was served with an almost comical solemnity. Waiters moved like ghosts among the guests, and conversation limped along in broken starts, most of it revolving around the weather, the flowers, the caterer, anything except the seismic revelation that had shattered the rehearsal just hours earlier. Finally, Uncle Thomas, ever the master of ill-timed humor, raised his glass. "Well, who would have thought?" he said, his voice too loud, too forced. "The so-called black sheep ends up the biggest star of the family." Several guests tittered nervously, lifting their glasses toward me in a half-hearted toast. I offered a small, noncommittal smile and lifted my water. I wasn't interested in their sudden, shallow admiration. Admiration that had more to do with status than with anything real. Across the table, Daniel slammed his fork down with a sharp clatter. "She's not a star," he said, his voice tight with fury. "She quit. When things got tough, she walked away." Silence fell like a hammer. Forks paused midair. Heads turned. I set down my glass carefully. I counted to 5 in my head, then 10, and when I spoke, my voice was steady, clear. "I didn't walk away because it was hard, Daniel," I said quietly. "I walked away because it wasn't my calling. There's a difference." Daniel scoffed, but before he could launch into another tirade, another voice cut through the tension. "My father." "For God's sake, Daniel," Dr. Richard Lawson said, his voice weary. "Enough." Every eye swung toward him. I turned slowly to face the man who had once told me I was dead to him. "You were competitive with your sister from the time you could walk," my father continued, his gaze pinned on Daniel. "We encouraged it too much. We made it clear that success was the only currency that mattered in this family. And when Amelia chose a different path, we treated her like a traitor instead of a daughter." Daniel stared at him, stunned. "So did I. And for that," my father said, turning his piercing blue eyes to me, "I am sorry." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward. I couldn't breathe for a moment, not because I doubted his words, but because I'd spent so many years believing this moment would never come. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flowery or overwrought. It was simple, honest, and somehow that made it all the more powerful. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the apology without reaching for it. Forgiveness wasn't a switch to be flipped. It was a process, one that would take time if it ever came at all. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Daniel muttered responses to the occasional question, but otherwise kept his head down. My mother, bless her, valiantly steered the conversation towards safer waters, asking me about recent cases, upcoming judicial reforms. I answered politely, offering just enough to satisfy curiosity without opening myself up further. As dessert was served, Aunt Susan leaned toward me with a conspiratorial smile. "Judge Lawson," she whispered, "you must tell me what it's like to send someone to jail. Is it as thrilling as it sounds?" I smiled thinly. "Justice isn't about thrills," I said. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." She blinked at me, clearly not understanding, but I wasn't speaking for her. I was speaking for myself, for the girl who had once been deemed unworthy of a seat at this table, and who now sat at its very center, not because she clawed her way in, but because she no longer needed their permission to exist. After dinner, as guests drifted away toward the lounge and the veranda, my father approached me once more. He looked older under the soft chandelier light, the lines around his mouth deeper, the proud set of his shoulders softened by something almost human. "You've done well, Amelia," he said simply, and for once I believed he meant it. The morning of what should have been Daniel's wedding day dawned gray and heavy with humidity, the sky low and restless above the sprawling lawns of Rosemont Estate. I dressed mechanically, pulling on simple jeans and a linen shirt, my mind still tangled in the wreckage of the night before. No one had seen Sophie after she walked away from Daniel at the rehearsal, and no one dared ask where she had gone. I slipped out the side door, craving fresh air, craving distance. The garden paths were damp underfoot, the scent of roses mingling with the sharp tang of rain yet to fall. I found myself drawn, almost without thinking, to the small stone bench by the reflecting pool, my grandfather's favorite spot, and sat, fingering the old pocket watch tucked safely inside my jacket. I don't know how long I sat there before a commotion from the main house shattered the uneasy peace. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the sharp bark of someone calling for an ambulance. I was already running before the words, fully registered. Inside the library, chaos reigned. My father slumped in a high-backed chair, pale and breathing heavily, one hand pressed to his chest. My mother hovered anxiously nearby, white as a sheet. A young doctor, one of Daniel's former classmates, was crouched at his side, checking vitals with brisk efficiency. "It's just angina," my father insisted, waving off the offered oxygen mask with a shaky hand. "Overexertion, that's all. You're not fooling anyone," the young doctor muttered, shooting a meaningful glance at my mother, who immediately began dialing 911. Daniel burst into the room moments later, medical bag in hand, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Without a word, he dropped to his knees beside our father and took over the examination, his movements fast, clinical, desperate. I stood by the doorway, frozen, the old instincts warring inside me. This wasn't my world anymore. I didn't belong to this clean, clinical theater of life and death. But then my father's eyes found mine across the room, and his hand lifted weakly. "Amelia," he rasped, "come here. Please." The weight of the moment nearly buckled my knees. Slowly I crossed the room, kneeling beside him opposite Daniel. He grasped my hand with surprising strength, his skin cool and dry against mine. "I may not get another chance to say this," he began, his voice thick and broken in a way I'd never heard before. "I was wrong, Amelia. I pushed you into a life you didn't want. And when you chose your own path, I abandoned you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his head bowed, his hands busy arranging the oxygen tube, even though it wasn't yet needed. "I let pride dictate my love," my father whispered. "Your grandfather warned me. He told me I'd regret it. And he was right. God help me, he was right." Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away fiercely. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let those words heal the jagged wound that had bled inside me for so long. But forgiveness, I knew, would not come in a single moment, no matter how heartfelt the apology. The distant wail of an approaching ambulance broke the fragile bubble around us. As the paramedics swept in and began preparations for transport, my father squeezed my hand once more. "I'm proud of you, Amelia," he said. "Whatever else happens, never doubt that again." They loaded him onto the stretcher, my mother trailing anxiously behind. As the paramedics rolled him out, Daniel stood and faced me, the facade he had worn for so long crumbling under the strain. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice rough. But even he didn't seem to believe it. I regarded him steadily. "Doesn't it?" For a long moment, Daniel simply stared at me, something wounded and raw flickering behind his carefully constructed armor. Then, without a word, he turned and followed the gurney down the hall. I exhaled slowly, the old pocket watch in my jacket pressing warm against my ribs. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight. Maybe some scars would always remain, but something had shifted. A truth had been spoken aloud at last, acknowledged instead of buried. And in that truth, there was the smallest, fragile seed of something I hadn't dared hope for in a very long time. Possibility. The waiting room at Memorial Hospital was frozen in a strange kind of limbo, too bright under the fluorescent lights, too quiet except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps or the rustle of paperwork. I sat rigidly in one of the stiff chairs, my hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of bitter coffee I had no intention of drinking. Daniel sat across from me, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he could bore a hole through the linoleum if he just focused hard enough. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional updates from the nurses. Stable, responsive, overnight observation recommended. Words that should have brought relief, but instead hung heavy in the sterile air. At some point, my mother returned from signing insurance forms, her face drawn but composed. She handed me a clipboard without a word, and I filled out the legal consents, my law training turning a numbing task into something mechanical, safe. Around 3 a.m, a young doctor finally emerged, his smile tired but genuine. "He's resting comfortably," he said. "You can see him briefly before he sleeps, but he needs rest." My mother squeezed my hand. "You go," she said softly. "Both of you." Daniel and I exchanged a glance. Old, complicated, heavy with history, and then without speaking we rose and followed the doctor down the hallway. The sight of my father hooked up to monitors, his chest rising and falling under thin hospital sheets, triggered a strange mixture of emotions: fear, sorrow, anger, but also, unexpectedly, compassion. He opened his eyes when he heard us approach and gave a weak smile. "My two overachievers," he murmured, the barest hint of humor threading his voice. Daniel managed a choked laugh. I simply stood there, unsure what to say, unsure if anything needed to be said. Some things lived in the spaces between words, in the weight of presence alone. After a few minutes, the nurse gently ushered us out. Back in the waiting room, Daniel slumped into a chair and scrubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to undo all the damage." I sat beside him, the distance between us feeling smaller than it had in years, and yet still so vast. "You don't," I said. "You can't undo it. You can only decide what you do next." He nodded slowly, the lines of strain etched deep around his mouth. "Sophie called," he said after a long pause. "Last night. She's staying with friends in Atlanta. She doesn't want to see me right now." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. "I told her the truth," Daniel continued, staring at the scuffed toes of his polished shoes. "About everything. About you. About me. About the pressure, the lies, all of it. And," I asked gently, "and she said she needs time," he whispered. "She said she needed to figure out if the man she agreed to marry was the man she really knew." A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the low hum of hospital machines behind closed doors. "I don't blame her," I said finally. "Sometimes, when the mask falls away, you don't recognize the person underneath." Daniel flinched, but nodded, accepting the blow without protest. "I thought," he said haltingly, "that if I built the perfect life, the perfect career, maybe the cracks wouldn't show. Maybe I could forget what I did, what I allowed to happen." I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the golden boy of the Lawson family. I saw a brother. Flawed. Human. Hurting. "We were both trapped," I said quietly. "In different cages, but cages all the same." He turned to me, his eyes shining. "Can we start over?" I thought about it, about all the years of silence, all the wounds still healing. And then I offered the smallest of nods. "We can start something," I said. "I don't know if it'll be what it was, but it can be real." A tentative, broken smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it too. 1 year later, I stood at the threshold of my new chambers in the federal courthouse of Savannah, the morning sunlight pouring through the tall arched windows, glinting off the polished wood paneling and crisp white trim. A brass plaque beside the door gleamed under the light, "The Honorable Amelia Lawson." My fingertips brushed the engraving lightly, as if to reassure myself that it was real, that I had truly made it here, step by painstaking step. The black robe felt heavier on my shoulders than ever before, but not burdensome. It felt earned, weighted with the battles fought and the scars hidden beneath pressed fabric and steady smiles. Inside, my clerk was already waiting with the morning's docket. First up was a housing rights case, a community legal team fighting a corrupt developer. As I skimmed the briefs, a familiar name caught my eye. Sophie Turner. I looked up sharply, and there she was, standing confidently at the plaintiff's table. No engagement ring glinting on her hand now. Just simple, professional elegance and a calm authority that hadn't been there a year ago. When court was called to order, she addressed me not with hesitation, not with awkwardness, but with steady respect. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing clearly across the room, "the plaintiff is prepared to present." We moved through the morning's proceedings with the kind of rhythm that only came from true purpose. As we recessed briefly for lunch, Sophie approached the bench, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "Congratulations," she said. "The nomination, it's well deserved." I blinked in surprise, caught off guard. Rumors had been swirling for months now about my name being placed on the short list for the next federal appellate court appointment, one step below the Supreme Court itself. I had dismissed them as courthouse gossip, but maybe they were more real than I allowed myself to believe. "Thank you," I replied simply, my voice steadier than I felt. And she hesitated, then smiled, a smile full of 1,000 unspoken acknowledgments. For what it's worth, I think Daniel finally sees things more clearly now. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the truth neither of us needed to spell out. That evening I met my parents for dinner, something that had become a tentative, monthly tradition. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't rewrite history, but we built something new, fragile, sometimes awkward, but real. The house I had grown up in had changed too. The heavy, oppressive portraits had been replaced by my mother's artwork, vivid landscapes and sunlit beaches that spoke of freedom rather than legacy. Even my father seemed lighter somehow. He had stepped down from his position as chief of surgery and now lectured part-time, mentoring young doctors without the crushing burden of perfectionism he had once wielded like a scalpel. After dessert, my mother pulled me aside into her cozy new study. She handed me a slim, leather-bound scrapbook. Inside, she had compiled newspaper articles about my rulings, transcripts from notable cases, even handwritten notes from grateful families whose lives I had touched. "I wanted you to know," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that I see you, Amelia. I always should have. I'm sorry it took me so long." I closed the book gently, the lump in my throat too large to speak around. Sometimes healing didn't come in grand gestures, but in small, painstaking stitches, sewn one apology, one shared meal, one quiet moment at a time. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Coffee tomorrow. My treat. No lectures, no guilt trips. Just brother and sister." I smiled despite myself, typing back a simple, "Sounds good." As I prepared for bed, I paused by my nightstand where my grandfather's pocket watch rested, gleaming softly under the lamp's glow. I picked it up, tracing the worn engraving with my thumb. WJL, William James Lawson, the man who had believed in me when no one else did. I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket for the next day's hearings. A reminder that legacies aren't handed down like heirlooms, they're forged. Choice by choice, battle by battle, inch by inch. When I looked into the mirror, I didn't see the girl they had cast out in shame anymore. I saw the woman who had rewritten the meaning of her name. And the view, just as my grandfather had promised, was beautiful indeed.